Our next speaker, out of the photo op mode, is a Boston-based physician and author and filmmaker and an activist. Dr. Falk mentioned the defamatory tactics, and one defamatory tactic with which we're all familiar is labeling someone an anti-Semite. Another, which has not been used as often as it was maybe 20 years ago, is to label someone a self-hating Jew. Dr. Alice Rothschild is involved in the activities for human rights and social justice in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She's an active member of Jewish Voices for Peace, American Jews for a Just Peace, the Workmen's Circle Mideast Working Group, and she has been organizing health and human rights delegations to Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza since 2003. Please welcome Dr. Alice Rothschild.
Thank you so much. I just got back from Gaza 3 days ago, if I'm a little verklempt, as we say. So first of all, I want to talk about what silencing looks like. It kind of overlaps with active muzzling, with a strict framing of the dominant paradigm. It involves a widespread systemic intolerance of alternative framing. Silencing challenges free speech, rights of protest. It's all about power, about fear, and about the broad cultural and political assumptions in the world that we live. So I'm going to first speak from my personal experiences as a self-hating Jew, as you mentioned. In 2004, I had come back from the region, and I wanted to do grand rounds, and I was invited to Cambridge Hospital to speak on the impact of war and occupation on civilians. And before my presentation, one of my colleagues came and leafleted the auditorium with these horrific pictures of Jews who'd been blown up by suicide bombers. And after my presentation, he got up and harangued me for 10 minutes, accusing me of lack of compassion for Jews. I wanted to do a similar kind of discussion about healthcare and occupation in my own hospital. I was told by my department chief that I was, quote, a danger to the Jewish people. It took 5 years in his leaving, and I kept trying to do my talk, and finally they said yes. My talk was announced, and they received 100 emails protesting my giving these grand rounds. And I had to take the word occupation outside of the title of my talk, and I was told to stay away from politics. So fast forwarding the last year and a half, I've been doing a lot of book touring with my 2 books and my film and doing a lot of presentations. So I've been bumping up against a lot of muzzling. So in the academic setting, I was at American University, and I was talking with students who found that if they focused on human rights, on opposition to occupation, supporting BDS, etc., they found themselves marginalized and accused of bias. They described a campus that was polarized with no conversation between the right and the left. 2 professors had been included in the list of professors who are dangerous to Israel, and one untenured faculty member talked about being warned to limit his comments, critical comments about Israel, because it would endanger his future career. At John Carroll University, at a political science class called Peacemaking in the Palestine-Israel Conflict, there were complaints from the local Hillel stating that Jewish students on campus did not, quote, feel safe having me on campus, and I hit that a lot, that I make students feel unsafe. And they actually had a major meeting of the faculty to determine whether I could be allowed on campus, which I was. And the most disturbing part of that little event was at the end, the Israeli Shalicha, which is an ambassador that the Israeli government sends out to schools and temples and things like that to, do Israel messaging. And she basically came up to me in front of all the people and started screaming at me, attacking me as a liar, doing a great disservice to the Jewish people, and just being a general bully, which was kind of an interesting experience. At the University of Maryland, at an Arab media class, One Jewish student told the professor after I spoke that he was very unhappy with my presentation. He was disappointed in the professor. He accused me of hate speech, and he said he felt offended as a member of Hillel. At the University of Virginia, at a book club, I was doing a book reading, and several alumni complained and took it all the way to the president of the university that I should not be allowed to read from my book, and then threatened to withhold funds since I was allowed. When I've been in more religious institutions, there's a church in our DC suburbs that shares a building with a temple. They've had a long positive relationship, and the rabbi told the minister there that if he showed my film, that he would sever their relationship. There was a church in Vermont with a very wonderful pastor who does a lot of work with a progressive Accept Palestine rabbi who really pushed him hard when he invited me to the church. And I saw the emails, and the tone of the emails were, "I'm profoundly disappointed in you. We've worked together on all these issues. I thought I could trust you. And now you are showing this anti-Semitic, one-sided film from this known self-hating Jew." When I try to speak in temples, that's like getting up against the wall of McCarthyism, but I've had a couple of little successes. There was a Reform temple in Ithaca, which I found that whenever they have announcements about speakers like me, the person who does the newsletter puts a little disclaimer saying, "This does not represent the opinions of the temple." And I also found, as I made my rounds of the few temples that would let me in, is that their maps of Israel are all the greater Israel, including all the occupied territory. So that was sort of fascinating to find out. I was invited to an Orthodox synagogue in DC by an Orthodox human rights lawyer who's also a Hebrew school teacher there. We set up the film, and the rabbi canceled it. At the Greater Jewish Community, I was in Sacramento. There's a Jewish Federation newspaper called Jewish Voice. For 2 times in a row, they've refused to publish an announcement that I'm in town, once doing a book reading, once showing my film, because they say that I am anti-Israel. In a Jewish community, in a public library in Ohio, I had this totally conflicted, agonized audience. They were completely unaware of the many millions of dollars that are being spent on Israeli Hasbara and the aggressive control of Israel messaging. And one woman got up and she said, "We could have this open conversation anywhere in the United States, but in Arab countries, we would be censored, arrested, and sold into sex slavery." I pointed out that actually I cannot have this conversation anywhere in the United States. In fact, I can't have this conversation in most temples, Hillels, and Jewish community centers. She then pointed out that the poster for my talk was very offensive because it had the word conflict in it and a picture of the separation wall. So she said, "It says what side you're on." The most disturbing point in this very interesting public library came at the end when a little old lady comes up to the poor woman who's selling my books and announced in a very loud voice that my book should be burned, at which point a gentleman standing behind her said, "That's what they did in Nazi Germany." And last February, I was leaving New York City, and I saw this huge billboard, I don't know if you've seen it, that says, "New York Times against Israel, all rant, all slant, stop the bias." This is sponsored by the wonderfully well-funded and ironically misnamed Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America. So silencing can be both active, and it also comes through how we frame the issues and the language, and what are the assumptions behind it. So going back to that temple in Ithaca, one of the machers in the Jewish community challenged me on my maps, and she basically said, you know, the Arabs were the migrants, and as she said, the last independent indigenous nation was 2,000 years ago, and she referred me to a right-wing blog for accurate information. I was at World Fellowship in New Hampshire, which is a wonderful family camp for progressives, and a woman in the audience told me this amazing story. Her child was attending public school in the New York City school system, and they were studying indigenous peoples. And as an example, the teacher stated that the Jews were the indigenous people and the Palestinians were treating them badly. So the daughter, being her daughter, piped up and she said, no, it's really the other way around. And the girl was sent out of class to the principal's office. Her parents were called in, and they were given a stern warning about that kind of talk. And when the mother agreed with the daughter, the principal actually said that that version of history is not allowed in the New York City school system. And just recently, I got this award from my town in Brookline for social justice work on Israel-Palestine. And both of the elected officials in the Massachusetts legislature boycotted the event. They're usually presenting the awards, and one funder pulled out. So that's what you see in your community. If we look at the issue of framing and language, the framing is the Jews are good, the Arabs are bad, and you think about the visuals. In our newspapers, there's a tendency towards the sympathetic Jewish settler mother crying over her injured child, and the young man wrapped in a keffiyeh throwing a rock. That's the two visuals you see. And so there's an emotional message in our media that rarely portrays Palestinians as fellow human beings who may actually have some incredibly legitimate grievances, and who actually are rarely violent. So Palestinians are never seen as the most educated group in the Arab world, they're never seen as the people with a long tradition of nonviolent resistance. You just don't see that. And so the question is, why is history that? Because history in our world is really a creation of groupthink. And if you go back in history, for decades, Palestinian history, trauma, aspirations, rights have been really invisible in Western discourse. I think it's partly a reflection of our own racism towards Arabs, our Islamophobia, guilt about the Holocaust, and manipulation by Zionist leaders, and then we add in cultural, economic, and military imperialism. So how far does this go back? Well, there was early silencing of the Palestinian experience by US Zionists in the 1940s and the 1950s. So even back then, you would be viciously attacked if you criticized the partition plan, if you criticized Jewish nationalism and all that kind of stuff, or you mentioned that there was a Palestinian tragedy. And so journalists were accused of anti-Semitism. They were threatened, politicians were threatened with loss of financial support. I mean, this goes way back to the founding of Israel. And then, as was mentioned, in 1974, the Anti-Defamation League officially defined what they called the new anti-Semitism as criticism of Israel. And 10 years later, AIPAC issued this college guide exposing the, quote, anti-Israel campaign on campus, which they still think is going on, and basically was trying to tell students why they shouldn't listen to people who are critical of Israel because they're all obviously foreign terrorists and anti-Semitic. So you see this kind of McCarthyism crept into Jewish institutions, and the epithet of anti-Semitism has been used ever since to silence and demonize critical voices. The Israelis joined in the fray with the Herzliya Conference in 2010, where they had a whole session on winning the battle of the narrative, and it's all about rebranding. It's a PR problem. And then a year later, the Raut Institute in Tel Aviv, it's a think tank, issued a position paper laying out the strategy of, quote, naming and shaming those on the left who are critical of various things. And the important thing is that they identified a strategy to engage Jewish institutions and individuals, to identify and marginalize groups, to separate medium-sized liberals from more critical liberals, and to create this Israeli brand. And you also see at that point the word, they go against people who are delegitimizing Israel. So that's another word that comes up. So what's happening now is a direct result of those kinds of policy decisions. People talk about shielding Israel from the abuse of human rights law. And then in 2011, Haaretz reported that there was actually an Israeli military intelligence unit that was created to monitor folks like us. So in academia, we have Hillel International, which is the umbrella organization for the Hillel chapters on American campuses. It did start out not as a Zionist organization, but it's basically become an Israel advocacy organization. And despite, espousing pluralism and tolerance, they actually have very strict guidelines about what you're allowed to talk about and what kind of speakers you're allowed to have. And in December of 2014, Hillel International and the Simon Wiesenthal Center developed a new campus surveillance tool, which is a phone app, to fight anti-Semitism, which will be deployed on 550 US campuses with Hillel centers. And it's supposed to report students and professors who are being anti-Semitic, and they call it See It and Report It. The Anti-Defamation League last December also published a blacklist of those who have linked what's going on in Ferguson with what's going on in Palestine. And also, as was mentioned, there have been more than 6,000 US police trained in Israeli police and military units, and this is funded by the ADL. It's also funded by JINZA, which is another group to watch, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. And you may not know that the New York City Police Department now has a branch in Tel Aviv. So we now have our police emulating the Israeli Defense Forces. We have academics being monitored and attacked. We have university donors pressuring administrators. We have groups sympathetic to Palestinians being confronted with lies. And I suggest you Google Hamas on campus. It's a really interesting YouTube. And then people are emotionally blacklisted and called anti-Semitic. Now, in the Jewish community, there's actually a tremendous conflict because Jews have traditionally been more left-wing on every other right but Palestine. And many of us, particularly people under 35, which obviously doesn't include me, feel that we are being asked to suspend our love of justice, democracy, and fighting for the oppressed when it comes to Israel-Palestine. And we see very right-wing forces, Campus Watch, Stand With Us, Camera, AIPAC, David Project, et cetera, aligned with the Christian right, lobbying Congress to support the most right-wing governments in Israel. I call this our own US branch of the Likud. And then we have muzzling of dissent and tolerance in our own community. So these assumptions are reinforced. The Jews are the good people, Arabs are the bad people, Jews are like us, they're white people creating a Western-style state in a savage, untamed region of the world. So after 1967, there was this move towards making uncritical support of Israel the cornerstone of being a good Jew. And so being a Jew and a Zionist are now merged, and Israel is the religion. Christian Zionists marched up and embraced the idea we all got to return so we can have an apocalypse, so they embraced the settler movement. Liberal Christians then bought the mythology. The US government developed our huge military-industrial complex. And with this framing, the history and trauma and aspirations of Palestinians becomes more and more invisible. So this manipulation happens by controlling the message. And how is that done? We have birthright trips, which are basically brainwashing. We have students that have been recruited, and I've heard paid, to use social media to compliment Israel. They call this public diplomacy. There are a ton of free junkets for all kinds of people, ranging from academics to food and wine critics, to go to Israel. We have all the academic collaborations. We have our Israeli ambassadors in all sorts of Jewish settings enforcing what the message is. And so there is this multi-million-dollar industry to brand Israel with pinkwashing, greenwashing, faith washing, there's all those kind of things. The good news is that there is pushback. There is a lot of pushback towards greenwashing and pinkwashing and faith washing, and if you don't know what it is, just ask me. And there's also pushback within the Jewish community. We are not monolithic. More than 50% of Jews in America, particularly those under 35, have no interest in Israel or feel some sympathy for Palestinians. And the interesting thing for me as a confirmed secular Jew is that many groups are questioning all of this framing using Jewish values and doing it in the name of Jewish religion. So I have young students telling me Zionism has hijacked Judaism. And we keep mentioning Jewish Voice for Peace. This is an example of the growth of one of those kinds of groups. We tripled in size during the Gaza war. A group called If Not Now came out during the Gaza war, demanding that Jewish communal organizations recognize the Gaza dead. We have the Open Hillel movement, which is demanding that Hillels do not monitor and have these red lines, and these kids are having these conferences, breaking all the rules, talking about BDS in Hillels. And that actually did happen just in February at Harvard. 3 civil rights leaders from the 60s got up and talked about BDS at Harvard Hillel, and we all were very happy. The other thing that you're seeing is what I call an increase in intersectionality, so that there are unified coalitions forming between students of color, Muslim students from colonized countries, queer and trans students, feminists, all seeing the links between the oppressions of Palestinians and their own oppressions. So in conclusion, because I'm going to get this in 18 minutes, what is happening to Jews and their allies is a loud battle about the meaning and understanding of history. We're separating Judaism, the religion, from Zionism, the national political movement. We are making a call to define a Jew as someone grounded in religion or culture or history, a set of ethics, a sense of peoplehood, and all these definitions are equally compelling. It does not matter if you're in the diaspora, because Israeli Jews think us diaspora Jews are not really first-rate Jews. And so diaspora Jews are really reclaiming our legitimacy and our voice as Jews. There's a delineation of the racist ideology of anti-Semitism from thoughtful moral criticism of the policies of the country of Israel, and the treatment and solidarity of Palestinians has now become the civil rights movement of our day. We see major challenges such as the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, the campus open Hillel, Students for Justice in Palestine, etc. We have African American civil rights leaders embracing this issue and drawing parallels with our civil rights struggles. And with all of the increased amount of information that we now have access to, you really can't hide reality anymore. And I would like to propose that the intensity of the backlash and the muzzling may also reflect that the mainstream and right-wing forces are feeling increasingly cornered. Their positions are less defensible, and perhaps this is the beginning of a major turning point in the long struggle for justice in Israel-Palestine. Thank you.
Dr. Alice Rothschild, the civil rights movement of our day. She defines what we are witnessing. A generation ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said again, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
How do you understand history? Who controls the message? Is the media muzzled, lazy, confused, manipulated? How do you create personal and political change? I invite you to join me in exploring one of the most pressing and complex issues of our day.
In 1948, there was a lot of fighting around our house.
My eldest sister was shot.
A bullet come over our heads.
In 1967, I would call it the transformation from childhood to hell.
After the '67 war, if you weren't physically in the place where you were, you had no right to live in that place.
They're Palestinians, refugees.
This can't go on for much longer. People's eyes are beginning to open to what Israel's doing.
My name is Alice Rothschild, and I was born in 1948 in Boston. I'm an American Jew, interestingly enough, born the same year that the State of Israel was founded. My parents were first-generation Americans who instilled in us a sense that Jews were a distinct and often endangered tribe. This Jewishness soon became grounded in our love for Israel. But as I grew up, I realized I had never actually met an Arab before, and I only knew one side of this complex historical narrative. Starting in the 1990s, I began an active search for the voices that I had never heard.
And you know, people accuse my film of being unbalanced, and what I try to explain is that this is the history that you haven't learned. So I didn't try to make the history of the world, I tried to make the history of the people that you don't usually hear. So balance is a very tricky thing, but thank you for that comment. This is not a Jewish story or an Arab story or a Muslim story. This is a universal story, and we all need to be interested in it. And you know, in terms of the role of Christians in the United States, I mean, if you look at the Christian Zionist movement, who are actually a much more powerful movement than the Jews, Christian Zionists are very supportive of the settlements and the growth of settlements in the occupied territories. You'll be in some of these settlements, and I'm not talking a few huts on a hill, I'm talking about massive cities, and there are plaques to Hagee and to other, you know, mega church figures who have spent millions of dollars supporting the settlement movement, because the Christian Zionists want all of us Jews to go back so that we can all die in the apocalypse and Christ can come, and that just doesn't seem like a good plan to me. So, but the point is, the Christian Zionists are actually a very, very powerful force in this country, and that united with groups like AIPAC, which is a Jewish lobbying organization that I put on par with the NRA in terms of power and money and influence, they really control our Congress. So if a congressperson expresses a faint sympathy with the plight of a Palestinian or make some critical comment about Israel, the odds are they're not going to get elected the next cycle. And this happens over and over again. State of Israel, you know, it becomes increasingly clear that you can't be a democracy and privilege one group over another group. You can't be a democracy and have institutionalized and legalized a second-class citizenship. So I don't know quite what you call this, whether it's an ethnocracy or, yeah, I'm not sure the exact name, but I think that what Israel is coming, what the Israeli leadership is coming to heads with is that you got to choose. If you're a democracy, then you can't have the laws and the behaviors that are characteristic of the state. Building settlements and Jewish-only roads and Jewish-only bus systems. I mean, these are political, moral questions. This isn't about whether people are Jewish or not. And so what I think one of the big problems is that no one wants to be called an anti-Semite. I mean, that's a horrendous thing to call someone. But that, just like the Holocaust, that is being used to muzzle people. And so what I suggest to people is that if you're not a Jewish person and you're making principled criticism of the behavior of the Israeli government or the Israeli Defense Force, find your Jewish allies, stand together, because if we all stand together, we can protect each other. I mean, if someone calls me an anti-Semite, it doesn't do anything for me because I'm Jewish, and it just doesn't, they call me a self-hating Jew. I also don't buy it. So it doesn't have the power to shut me up, but it could have the power to shut you up. So if I'm standing with you, then we're in this together. And so I think, the power of groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a national organization, you should go on their website if you're not familiar with them. So I do think that if you're in the mainstream Jewish community, there is, in most communities, a very clear-cut line where if you support BDS, you will lose friends. And this is what I consider a great tragedy. And what I often say to people is, the way that I look at this conflict right now is that Palestinians have been living under occupation for, since '67, and we could, go back to '48 to colonization, but I don't start there. And they have a resistance movement. And when they had a violent resistance movement, everybody condemned them. And now they have a nonviolent resistance movement, and everybody condemns them. So what exactly are they supposed to do? So I really urge people to re-examine what their issues are, and to look at the idea that, first of all, the Palestinians have a right to resist, and that they are oppressed, and that a nonviolent resistance movement is the best thing going. And it's also very smart, because if you actually read the call, it's calling for an end to the occupation, it's calling for treating Palestinians with Israeli citizenship as equal citizens, and it's calling for a resolution of the refugee issue. And for that last one is the one that Jews get most ballistic over, because it calls for the support of the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And people get very crazy about that, and I really understand that. But the things that I suggest to people is that, first of all, Israel's going to have to change in some ways. The course that it's on is not a viable long-term course that's going to be successful for everybody that has to get along in that region. The other thing is that if you look at all the kinds of conferences and studies and books and smart people thinking about the right of return, they're not talking about Muhammad going back to Jaffa and throwing Moshe out of his house. They're trying to figure out, we have millions and millions of people living in refugee camps. We have all these people who've lost their land. Until there's some kind of restorative justice, there's never going to be a resolution to this conflict. So let's figure out all the creative ways that we could get enough justice so that this could be over and that people could move on. That this is a battle about land. So it's not a battle between Jews and Muslims. It's not a battle about religion. It's a battle about land. And if you look at what's going on in the West Bank, the West Bank is now divided into 3 areas. Area A is the area around the cities, which are the Palestinian cities, which are supposedly controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Area C is 65% of the West Bank, which is where the settlements are going. And Area B is a kind of in-between, partially Israeli, partially Palestinian controlled. And as I said, Area C is totally Israeli controlled. So the Israelis have, and I do suggest people grab this visual map, because it's a really good visual of all the numbers that are being thrown around. But if the Israelis now control the Jordan Valley, and they control the settlements and all the areas around the settlements, and they control the 7 to 8% that they got in the first war. Basically this is about taking land and putting facts on the ground and growing the number of places that Jews live, the Palestinians don't live. And so I think it's good to understand that this is a battle about land. I think that there are many Jews that really don't know and that have never heard the word Nakba, and that just have sort of willfully closed their minds to this history because it's too difficult and too painful and too challenging. And the irony for me as a member of the Jewish community is that Jews are so progressive on civil rights and gay rights and environment and all the other things, but when it comes to this, there's sort of a closing of the brain for a lot of people. And I'll just end my little comment here with, we were having an event in Boston, and there was this guy who was a professor and he was a leader in the Jewish community. And one of my friends said to him, why is Zionism so important? I mean, Zionism is a fairly recent development. I mean, when the Hillel started in the college campuses, they were not Zionists, which is most people don't remember. And then it became much more, you have to be a Zionist to be a Jew. And he looked at her and he said, you don't understand, Israel is the religion. And so in a lot of Jewish communities, there's a confusion between the religion and the country and the political movement of Zionism. And I think that that's a real disservice, first of all, to the religion. And it also means that we can't have an intelligent conversation about Israeli governmental policy and Zionism, which we absolutely need to do. Just like we need to have a conversation about US policy. I mean, you can be a patriotic American and oppose almost everything the US government does abroad, and you're still a patriotic American. We have to be able to have those conversations, and it's really hard to do in the Jewish community. I mean, I've talked with people who say there's no occupation. And if you look at the legalities of this, when the Israelis occupied the West Bank and Gaza, they made a very careful decision not to call it occupied. They call it acquired. And because it's acquired, it doesn't have to go according to the rules of occupation, so you can settle it. So, you can play with the language and make it into something that it's not. But this is the battle that we need to work on. This is why education is so critically important. So thank you. Thank you. We have Jimmy Carter, who used the word apartheid. So now you say the word apartheid and less people get totally freaked out. You have a war, and everybody's got their smartphones, and they're sending you documentation minute by minute of exactly what's happening. So a huge amount of history that used to be totally invisible is now visible. You have a huge nonviolent resistance movement in Palestine that has now gone international, that has organized major boycotts and sanctions, boycotts and divestments around major global industries that are having an impact. I mean, Veolia, which is a huge global industry that does transportation and garbage dumps and all sorts of stuff like that, lost their contract in Boston to do the school buses. And there was a unity between the unions that were getting screwed and the activists on Israel-Palestine who were saying, wait a minute, they're building Jewish-only trains and buses and they manage a huge garbage dump in the West Bank, and this is an immoral company. And they lost the contract. So there are over and over again companies that have been affected by the BDS movement. There's so much more awareness. The Palestinians are talking about going to the International Criminal Court. There are Israeli generals who are afraid to go to Europe because they're afraid they're going to get arrested. I mean, the tenor is changing. Because Dorothy said, if you're throwing a stone, you're not nonviolent. And the sort of message that I got was that, first of all, again, picking up a stone and throwing it at a tank is a way to claim your humanity, to be defiant, to maintain your self-esteem, and to also say, I own this stone, this is mine. And that there's also a very long tradition of throwing stones as a form of protest. And so we had these debates endlessly about whether, so I now call it unarmed resistance because a stone is not a military weapon. And it's very clear that if you throw a stone into an oncoming car and it breaks the window, people could die. But 99.99999% of the time, this is a 15-year-old throwing a stone at a tank. And And that 15-year-old will end up being arrested in the middle of the night and spend 6 months in jail. And that's what happens over and over again. So what do I see for the future? You know, I don't know how it's all going to turn out, but it seems to me that whatever political solution we have for the future has to be based on human rights for all. And whether it's 2 states or 1 state or federation or whatever it's going to be, and I really honestly don't know, it has to be based on equal human rights. And if we can get that as the foundation, then I think it's possible for everybody to work together to actually get to a peace ending. And also, I think that what's been proven is that the people there haven't been able to solve it. So this is going to take international pressure and grassroots pressure, and people are melting here. So I'm going to stop, and hopefully we can get the air conditioning on, and I'll meet you.
So for Jews, being victimized by an outside Christian culture, it's part of our core identity. We all feel like we all experienced the Holocaust and we all survived the Holocaust. For Palestinians, the Nakba is also a huge catastrophe. But for Palestinians, there has never been an opportunity to have closure on this trauma.
And this all led to my co-organizing delegations to Israel. We got into the Gaza once and to the West Bank since 2003 every year. And as was mentioned, I wrote a book about this experience, Broken Promises, Broken Dreams. And I started book touring because, you know, a lot of people won't invite an activist because that's kind of scary, but, you know, a doctor who wrote a book, that's kind of